Today, we're going to focus on a new section of the syllabus, and this one is all to do with databases. Now, we've been using a file-based approach in general. So normally you store data in a table or a file, which is normally sequential. So you write one thing after the other. And in this lesson, we're going to look at the limitations of using a file-based approach for the storage and retrieval of data. We're then going to look at the features of a relational database, one that involves multiple tables, and how that addresses the limitations of a file-based approach. You should also be able to show understanding of and use the terminology associated with a relational database model, for example, primary keys, foreign keys, and so forth. We're going to look at an entities relationship diagram to document a database design. We're also going to look at the normalization process. How do you cut down on repeated information to ensure that there is no data dependency or redundancy built in? We're going to, for a given set of database tables, be able to explain whether it is in a third normal form or not. And finally, we should be able to produce a normalized database design for a description of a database or a given set of data or a given set of tables. So you should be able to look at that and then say, well, okay, this is how we can put that into the first normal form, the second normal form, and the third normal form. We're going to be looking at all of that today. But as usual, we're going to begin by looking at the key terms. So do pause the video and make sure that you jot these key terms down. There's going to be a lot of them as usual because it's the beginning of a section. So obviously you need to know about databases, what they are, a structured collection of items of data that can be accessed by different application programs. Normally a file can only be accessed by that particular program that you write. We're also going to look at relational databases, a database design where the data items are linked by internal pointers or primary keys. What is meant by a table, which is a group of similar data in a database with rows for each instance of an entity and columns for each attribute, basically field names and records. Record, which is a row in a table in a database. Record, which is basically a row in a table in a database, normally contains all the data items belonging to one particular entity or an item or a person. Field is a column in a table in a database. It normally contains just one piece of information about a person or an item. Then we've got tuple, which is an instance of an entity, which is represented by a row in a table. That's another form for a record. Entity, anything that you can store data about. An attribute is just an individual data item. Nothing new here because most of you must have covered this at some point at IGCSE or previous to that. We're then going to look at specific terms like candidate key, primary key, secondary key, foreign key, relationships, referential integrity, which is a key term, and indexes. Just like indexes in arrays, databases can also have indexes to help speed up searching for the data. So take a moment to just pause the video and be familiar with these key terms. Primary key is a unique identifier for a table. So basically it's a special field which normally contains an ID number that references a particular record. Then you've got secondary and foreign keys, which are different variations. A candidate key that is an alternative to the primary key. So sometimes you might have two unique pieces of information. The first one becomes the primary key. The second is the secondary key. A foreign key is a primary key, which is perhaps the secondary key in another table. And it's used to make relationships, basically link two tables together. And referential integrity is the property of a database that does not contain any values of a foreign key that are not matched to the corresponding primary key. So that means that if the primary key doesn't exist in the main table, that foreign key will not exist in any of the other tables. Otherwise, you might be pointing out to a record that does not exist. For example, a customer might end up purchasing something, and then if the customer is deleted from the main table, the things that he bought still point to a phantom customer, and that could lead to crashes and other types of data errors. And next, we are looking at entity relationship diagrams or ER models, which is a graphical representation of a database and the relationship between the entities. We're going to be looking at normalization, which can be one of the most toughest things that comes across at AS level, It's the process of organizing data to be stored in a database into two or more tables and the relationships between those tables. So you minimize any duplication of data, which is data redundancy. Normalization has three stages: first normal form, second normal form, and third normal form. And at each stage, the status of the relational database is clarified. For example, in the first normal form, it should not contain any repeated groups of attributes or fields. In the second normal form, obviously, it should be in the first normal form, and it should not have any non-key attributes which are dependent on the primary key. So that means any fields which are not a key field shouldn't depend on the primary key. They should have their own separate table. And in the third normal form, obviously, it needs to be in the second normal form, and all non-key attributes are independent. That means that any particular keys all have their own tables, and they do not depend on anything else. So let's start by looking at the limitations of a file-based approach. Now, as we know from programming, a file is a collection of items of data. It can be structured as a collection of records where each record is made up of fields containing data about the same thing. And individual elements of data can be called data items. So you can store that all together in a sequential format. When a program is used for data processing, the organization of any records used depends on how the program is written. So what goes first, what comes second, all of that order is described in the program that you're writing it. And these records can be fixed or a variable in length, and each record may also contain information about its structure. For example, the number of fields or the length of a particular record. If these records are to be processed by another program, that program must be written to use the exact same record structure. So if you decided to have first name, surname in that particular order, and that program reads it in that particular order, fantastic. But if another program reads surname first and then first name, then you've got a bit of an issue going on. And this can cause problems if updating programs is not carefully managed. So you need to look at the file structure, you need to look at every new program you're developing to ensure that it is compatible. So file-based approach is limited because, well, storage space is wasted when data items are duplicated by separate applications, and then some data ends up becoming redundant. Data can be altered by one application and not by another. It then becomes inconsistent. And inquiries available can depend on the structure of the data and the software used. So the data is not independent in that case. So when you're searching for it, for example. So on screen, you see a short example where we've got a record structure where you've got first name, second name, address, phone number, staff number, and a payroll program actually uses it for record descriptions, validation rules, and processing code. And another program uses something similar. It's got the validation rules, processing code, record descriptions are in the program, but the record structure involves name. So the first name and the second name is combined. They're not split apart. You've got the staff number, you've got target sales and actual sales. So you've got different sets of files which have repeated information being utilized by both programs. And we could technically combine them into one file or one database if we thought ahead. Now, before we start discussing the advantages of a relational database over a traditional file-based approach, we need to actually understand what a database is. In simplest terms, a database is a structured collection of items of data that can be accessed by different application programs. So databases are basically tables.
And the keyword is structured. So the data that is stored in databases is structured as a collection of records, predominantly as rows, where each record is made up of fields containing data about the same thing. So the fields are going to be the columns. So an example I can give you is in a car table, you will have all the information about a car in a row, and each column will contain just one aspect, like the name of the car, the model number, the color, and so forth. Now, a relational database is a database in which the data items are linked by internal pointers, also known as primary and foreign keys. Now, generally we're used to a single table, which is similar to a file-based approach. Now, in a single table, data can be repeated, which leads to data redundancy. Data can be duplicated in these records, which can lead to inconsistency when you're changing individual records, and these are the same problems as a file-based approach. Now, in order to solve these, we need to use relational databases. So coming back to our previous example where you had two programs which were looking at storing data differently. the one about the member of staff and the payroll. Well, in that particular case, what we could do is we can take the name of a member of staff and their staff number and store it in a separate table. So that data is only stored once.
Just to go back to that example where we had a business that stored payroll and sales data in separate files.
Several problems occurred using a file-based approach. For example, the name of a member of staff and their staff ID number are stored twice. The way the staff name is stored is different for each program. One was storing it in first name and second name. The second was storing it all together. If the staff number was changed by the payroll program and not by the sales program, these fields may contain different values for the same member of staff. For example, a person could get promoted or demoted. The fields in the two files are also in a different order. The staff number is the 5th field in the payroll program, but in the sales program, it's the 2nd one. So a file-based approach generally is limited because storage space is wasted when data items are duplicated by separate applications and some data ends up being redundant. And of course, data can be altered by one application and not by the other one, and that becomes inconsistent. And of course, the inquiries available can depend on the structure of the data and the software used, so the data is not actually independent. It depends on the program that's actually using it. Now, these were the problems that were occurring based on the file-based approach. How do we go about solving it? So once we separate the staff name and the staff number, then those details are only stored once. So any changes made to the data by the payroll application will also be seen by the sales processing application and vice versa. The fields are the same and in the same order. That basically means that storage space is not wasted as data items are only stored once, meaning there is little or no redundant data. Data is altered in one application. For example, if the payroll program alters the staff ID number, that's also available to the sales application. So data becomes consistent. And the inquiries available are not dependent on the structure of the data or the software used. So the data is now independent of the programs as well. So any of the programs, whether it's the payroll program or the sales program, if they alter something in the data, the other program accesses that as well. So let's start delving into relational databases in a bit more depth. A relational database's data structure can look similar to a file-based structure, as it also consists of records and fields. So basically it contains tables as well, but rather than having a singular table, it can have multiple tables. A table is a group of similar data with rows for each instance of an entity and columns for each attribute. A record is a row in a table, that's the terminology we use, a record, and a field or an attribute is a column in a table in a database. So on screen, you have an example of a table, and you can see that for each student, their date of birth is there and their class ID is there. So Nurbeig's details are all in the same row, and all the first names are going to be in a column format. Okay? So pretty straightforward stuff here. The new terminology that you will probably encounter at AS level is entities. So an entity is anything that can have data stored about it, such as a person, place, event, or object. An attribute is an individual data item stored for an entity. To use the same example as before, for student attributes, they could be first name, second name, date of birth, and class. A tuple is one instance of an entity, which is represented by a row in a table. So a tuple is basically a record, an attribute is basically a field, an entity is any object data can be stored about. So normally there would be a table about a student, a table about cars, a table about teachers, a table about planes, whatever that object is that you're storing data about in that table is the entity. So why are we using these new terms? Well, if you think about it, records and fields are also used in a file-based approach. So there is no particular distinction. So to make that distinction, we end up using tuples instead of records and attributes instead of fields to make sure that when a designer is planning it, the person who's going to actually create the system knows what they're talking about. So these terms are related to relational databases. So in an exam, make sure you know the distinction. Key term relational means that there is a relationship between two different tables in a database. So a relational database uses pointers between the tables to link them together. These pointers are keys that provide relationships between tables, and there are different types of keys. Now at IGCSE, you would probably be introduced to the concept of primary key, which is basically a unique identifier for each row in a table. In relational databases where you have multiple tables which need to be linked together to each other, there are different types of keys. So first you will have a candidate key, which is basically an attribute or field where no tuple has the same value. So you might have multiple fields which are unique. So they become candidate keys. A candidate to be elected as the primary key, something like that. Then of course you've got the primary key, which is the unique identifier selected. Then you've got a secondary key, which is a candidate key that is an alternative to the primary key because sometimes you might need to use it. And then you've got the foreign key, which is a set of attributes in one table that refer to the primary key in another table. So this is the one that is used to link two tables together. An example I'll give you straight off the bat is that you might have a student ID number which identifies a student's name, their address, and all of that kind of stuff. So when you have a class table where you might have a teacher and then you need to have students, so this student ID number, which is the primary key for the student table, becomes the foreign key for the class table because you can link that class and the student together. We're going to be looking at this in a bit more depth later on. So let's start by looking at the example that you see on screen. So a database of chemical elements contain a table elements with attributes symbol, name, and atomic weight. Now if you look at this, all three of these are candidate keys because the symbol is unique, the name is unique, and the atomic weight is unique. So in this particular case, the symbol might be recognized as the primary key, and the other two are going to be the secondary keys because they can be used as the primary key as well if needs be. Now most tables end up with only one candidate key which is used as a primary key, but in some cases you might end up with multiple, and then the choice of which one is the primary key depends on the designer. So a relationship is formed when one table in a database has a foreign key that refers to a primary key in another table in the database. In order to ensure referential integrity, the database must not contain any values of a foreign key that are not matched to the corresponding primary key. Think about the term referential integrity, referencing integrity. So what you're looking at is that when you have a foreign key that is pointing to a primary key that doesn't exist, the reference does not work. You're pointing to a location that does not exist, and that can lead to all sorts of errors and inconsistencies. So if you're looking at the example of the student and the class, which is on screen, the class table has a class ID where there's a teacher name and a location. And what happens in the student table, the student belongs to a particular class. So you're linking it to that particular table by ensuring that class ID acts as the foreign key as well. So Tahir studies in 7A, and 7A is present in the class table and is taught by Mr. Khan. Now if, for example, there was a foreign key that said 8A and 8A did not exist in the class table, then you've got a bit of a problem, and that's basically referential integrity, and that's something we need to maintain. Or for example, if 7A is deleted from the class table but it's still present in the student table, then that's going to cause a referential integrity error. Now relationships can take several forms. The basic one that you have is a one-to-one relationship. Then you have one-to-many, many-to-one, and many-to-many. The relationship between student and class is many-to-one, as one value of the attribute class ID may appear many times in the student table, but only once in the class table. For example, there are going to be a lot of students in 7A, but there's only going to be one 7A. So one class, many students. Now, if you were looking at the relationship from the other end, class versus student, then we can call it a one-to-many relationship. So when you're defining a relationship in the exam, look at what entity comes up first, and based on that you define the relationship. So if it was class and student, then it's one-to-many. If it's student and class, then it's many to one. They're basically the same relationship, just the order is different. Another aspect is the use of an index. In order to speed up searching for data, sometimes you can use an index, and you can index primary keys and foreign keys as well. This is basically a data structure which is built from one or more columns in a database table. And in the student table, we can index class, second name, and first name to provide class lists in alphabetical order of second name. So for example, each combination can be given a particular index, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then when you're searching for class lists and you're searching to print it out, you just look at the index data structure rather than all the other data, because it's already been sorted out in a particular order, and that can be used to find things or search for things. But before we get into the process of making a database, we need to design it first. And this is where the relationships are actually fleshed out. And in that particular process, the entity relationship diagram comes in handy. An ER diagram can be used to document the design of a database, and this normally provides an easy, understandable, visual representation of how all the entities in a database are related to each other. Now on screen, you see our student and our class table, and you'll probably see that one class has many students, or many students belong to one class. And that's represented by a relationship line between those fields, which are perhaps the primary key and the foreign key in the respective tables. So the class ID in class is the primary key of the class table. That's linked to the foreign key in the student table called class ID. So we keep the names the same, so it makes it easier to link things together. Now the class ID is a foreign key because student table already has a primary key called the student ID. Now, if you want to represent the relationships between the diagrams, there are a number of different ways that you can represent them. And on screen to the right-hand side, you can see how we represent one-to-one relationships, many-to-one, and zero-to-one, and so forth. Now, in the exam, we're probably not going to get the 0 or 1 or 0 or many relationships. We're just going to be looking at the one-to-many, one-to-one, or many-to-many type relationships. And if you were going to represent the many-to-many type relationship, both ends of the line will have those little 3 lines. And if you're doing one-to-one, then both ends of the line will just have a single line crossing it. Now these type of questions are very common in the exam, and they're very simple to answer. So you just need to identify the relationship. You might have one mother, one child, or one mother, many children, and depending on what the context says, you draw the appropriate lines. Now, in the exam, one of the most trickiest questions you'll encounter will be the normalization one. And the normalization process is used to construct a relational database that has integrity and in which data redundancy is actually reduced. Now, the tables that you're given or the table that you're given are not going to be normalized. And that means that the data in it will be repeated, it'll be larger than expected. And as more data is stored, it will be harder to update the database when changes are made. And obviously that will make it more difficult to extract the required data to answer things like queries. And this may cause problems when alterations are made to the records themselves. For example, every time a new student is added, the teacher's name, address, license number, date of birth, and the location of the classroom needs to be added as well. So you're repeating that information. And for example, if Mr. Khan leaves, there might be multiple students where you need to go and change the teacher name and perhaps their license number. And if all the students from a particular class, like class 7B, leave, then all details about the class 7B will actually be lost, because everything related to the class is actually stored with each student. So if you delete a particular student, that class data goes. And obviously if you delete all the students, all the class data will go and it will not be present anywhere else. Now, in order to solve that problem, we use normalization, and normalization has rules, and we need to focus on the first 3 forms of normalization. The first normal form, the second normal form, and the third normal form. And of course you can have more normal forms, but in practice we only go up to third normal form. So let's start with the first one. In the first normal form, entities do not contain repeated groups. of attributes. Now we know that attributes are fields, so if you got repeated attributes in a table, then it's not in the first normal form. If their data that is joined, for example, first name and surname is put together into one name, it's not atomic. That means it's not at its very base level. So that means it's not in the first normal form. So data has to be atomic. There should be no repeated groups of attributes. So you can't have, for example, two classes or two addresses in there. That's a repeated attribute. Okay. The second normal form, entities need to be obviously in the first normal form, and any non-key attributes depend upon the primary key, and there are no partial dependencies. Now what that basically means is that if you've got fields which are not the candidate keys, or they're not the foreign keys, or they're not the primary keys, then they should only depend upon the primary key. So a good example would be that the teacher information shouldn't really depend upon the student ID or the student information, because they're actually not related to each other. So there is a partial dependency somewhere in the system, and we need to eliminate that. And we're going to look at this in a bit more detail in a moment. The third normal form, entities need to be in the second normal form, and all non-key attributes are independent. The table contains no non-key dependencies. So that means that every field in that particular table depends upon the primary key. It's related to that. You don't have any field in there which is not related to it. So, for example, the class details, the teacher details in that table that we saw earlier will not be present in that table. So you will probably create a student table where you will have a student ID and just the information related to the students, like the student first name, surname, perhaps the student address, and so forth. There would be nothing related to class in there. There would be nothing related to the teacher in there, and you will need to create separate tables for that. So the rule is, when the database is in the third normal form, all attributes in a table depend upon the key, the whole key, and nothing but the key. And in the case of composite keys, where you might select two fields as the primary key, you will need to make sure that those are split. So you have individual tables. Or all the records depend upon both parts of that composite key. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail as well later. Okay, so let's start by working with this single table database that we just saw a moment ago. Right, so study this, make sure you are familiar with what the attributes are. Student ID, first name, second name, date of birth, subject name, subject teacher, class ID, location, teacher name, license number, address, and the teacher date of birth. So you can quite clearly see that there's a lot of repetition happening. For example, Mr. Yi, Miss Wu, Mr. Khan is being repeated a number of times for different subjects. So it's not quite clearly in the first normal form. There's a duplication going on. Perhaps you can also see that it's not even in the second normal form, because quite clearly we could have the student information separate and the subject information separate and the class information and the teacher information. So there's multiple tables we could make out of this, and you can just spot it straight away. So when we look at the first normal form, we've got to remember that this unnormalized school database can be split into two separate tables. One which has the student details, and the other which might have details about the subject. And the reason why it needs to be split that way is because the repetition or duplication is happening in the subject name and the subject teacher part. Everything else is pretty straightforward. You've just got one piece of data in there, but the subject name and the subject teacher obviously has repeated information. So we split that apart in that order. So we simply say, well, okay, student ID, first name, second name, date of birth, class ID, location, teacher name, license number, all of that has a single piece of information. And we move the subject name and the subject teacher to a new table. And we need to make sure that for every student, we put an ID in there to represent the link back to the original table. So we know that for the first student, S1276, there are 3 teachers and 3 subjects. So we will repeat S1276 3 times in there in separate records. And we'll say the first one is maths, Mr. Yi, history, Ms. Wu, geography, Mr. Khan. And we do the same thing for the 77 and the 99 students as well. Because to be in the first normal form, repeated attributes in a database need to be removed to a separate table and linked to the original table with a foreign key. And that's all that you need to remember. Now, there were two tables, and in the student subject table, the new one that we created, the primary key is actually a composite key because the student ID and the subject name together make a unique combination. Because if you think about student ID in the second table, it's being repeated 3 times, S1276, and obviously maths is being repeated for each student as well. So they don't actually have unique data. Even Mr. Yi, Miss Wu, and Mr. Khan are being repeated, so there's no field with unique data in there at the moment. So we can make a combination between two fields, in this case, student ID and subject name, to create something called a composite key. So both of them end up making a unique combination. So you can see where this is going to go now. Thing in the first table can depend upon the student ID, but the second table, you've got the subject teacher, which doesn't really depend upon the student ID, but depends upon the subject name as part of that composite key that we just made. So we're going to split that table by introducing a third table called subject. So we take the subject teacher and the subject name out, so maths, history, geography, and science, and then we put the relevant subject teachers there. So now the subject teacher depends upon the subject name, and in the middle table, subject name and the student ID are related, and then you can find out what the student's details are in the first table. And that's how you get everything to second normal form. In each table, there is no partial dependencies. Hence, the tables are now in the second normal form. Of course, there's some bits still to do with the class ID and the teacher and all of that, and that's obviously the next stage. So in the third normal form, it is worth inspecting the database and its contents to consider any other problems that could arise, such as teacher names might not be unique, therefore it's better to use the license number as the primary key, because you can end up with two teachers being called the same name. You know, their surnames could be exactly the same. And teachers can be both class teachers and subject teachers, so that needs to be combined in one table as well. So the purpose of the third normal form is to ensure that the database does not contain any non-key attributes or any fields which depend on another candidate key or a partial composite key. All the fields in a table should just depend on the primary key. So if you look at the first table, first name, second name, date of birth, all depend on student ID. The class ID is obviously now the foreign key, and that links to the class table. And similarly, if you look at the teacher table, which is the second one, the license number now becomes the primary key because that's unique, and the teacher name, the teacher address, and the teacher date of birth just depend on that license number. And then if you look at the class table, the class will have a teacher, which is denoted by the license number, and obviously they will have the class ID. And that's the link between the teacher and the student, all related through that class table. Now, the best way to learn about normalization is to actually practice. So let's start with this example. On screen, you see a single table, and before you start the normalization process, maybe you might want to identify the entities that are involved in this table and then draw an entity relationship diagram. So you've got contacts, you've got employees, what's the relationship between those? And the table kind of gives you some hints. So do pause the video and have a look at this activity. Once you've drawn the entity relationship diagram, you can then proceed with normalization. So do pause the video and try to finish this activity before moving on. Okay, hopefully you managed to work out the relationship between both. One employee can have many contacts, and during the normalization phase, you probably worked out that the employee information is going to be repeated for each contact. So you managed to split those apart and eventually end up with multiple tables. Now, if you're not sure about this, as usual, get back to me. But hopefully everything is clear and you now understand the limitations of a file-based approach. You should also understand what relational databases are and how they go about solving those limitations of a file-based approach. You should be able to identify the key parts of databases: records, tuples, fields, tables, attributes, entities, all of those kind of things. And you should also be able to identify and describe the 4 types of keys: candidate keys, primary keys, foreign keys, and composite keys. And finally, you should be able to explain the normalization rules, the first normal form, the second normal form, and the third normal form. Pay particular attention to those rules and why we need to normalize to ensure there's less data redundancy, less inconsistency, and you should be able to apply these rules to normalize the database. Now, normalization is an important topic. You normally do end up getting a question on this, either to normalize a database or to explain what normalization is. So do pay particular attention to this topic. That's all from me for today. I'll see you in the next one.